As a way of introduction, I've been working with the Oak Ridge DAAC for about 5 years, and I'm really involved in the Arctic data that's coming out of the NASA Above project. So as far as the motivation for bringing up this topic today, it was really because with the Above project, we've really become aware that users want to find and combine data sets from different organizations and agencies. And my goal is really to enable metadata cross-listing between our NASA-funded Above projects and the Canadian partnerships we've established as part of the Above project. And those data are housed in the Canadian Polar Data Catalog. So I don't know if anyone is on the call from the Polar Data Catalog or from Polar Knowledge Canada, but if they are, I'd love to talk about some more specific. I've definitely reached out to individuals there, but I don't know who all is going to be the best contact for this. So the time frame for my very specific goal here is by the end of September this year, I would like to be able to cross-list metadata between our data center and the Canadian Polar Data Catalog. Ideally, this would be based on API access, and if we work this out, I hope to be sharing NASA Above metadata with many different partners, including the Arctic Data Center, the NG Arctic project with Department of Energy, and many other groups. The NASA Earth Science Data System is designed to handle data from a variety of missions. Many of them are shown here, but what often goes overlooked is that there's a lot of ground-based data that's collected by NASA as well, and most of that ground-based data makes its way into the Oak Ridge DAAC, which I work at. So Oak Ridge DAAC, just very briefly, handles data from NASA's terrestrial ecology, carbon cycle, and ecosystems scientific domains. And these slides are available on the IARPC website, so I'm not really going to read everything, and you can just look them up at your leisure. But we have data in a variety of themes, and the very first theme alphabetically is Arctic, and so we have over 300 data sets that come from a bunch of historical projects like Boreas, which was conducted in the 90s and early 2000s with boreal and some Arctic research funded by NASA. And then, of course, we have the more recent Above project, as well as a bunch of other projects that sometimes have collected data or done modeling in Arctic regions. So as I said, we have over 350 data sets in Arctic domain, and many of them are pan-Arctic maps or large-scale compilations of remote sensing data across the Arctic. At Oak Ridge DAAC, we act as a data publisher, so we collect information from fieldwork or from remote sensing projects. We write documentation about it, we standardize it, and we then archive it in our website and distribute it to users across internationally. So we basically run a full pipeline from the raw investigator data to a cleaned up product that's distributed online. And we offer several APIs to access the data. As far as dissemination, the data comes in and is standardized, and then we are part of NASA's Earth Observing System Data Information System, or EOS DIS. And so we push our metadata to EOS DIS, but we also provide access to our metadata and data through other mechanisms, like Google Dataset search, by posting on social media and on mailing lists. And so we're looking for the widest possible dissemination and the widest usage of the data sets in our care that we can get. some specifics about the metadata that we produce. We do collect metadata for data bundles or collections, but also for every single individual data file. These include things like the spatial and temporal scope of the data, as well as keywords in the global change master directory vocabulary. And all of these metadata are submitted to the NASA Central Metadata Repository, or CMR. And from there, they're available via API in several different standard metadata formats. So I feel like we have a good way to distribute our metadata out, pushing out from us. It's more of a matter of figuring out what formats and types of metadata all of our interested partners would like to receive. So my questions coming in new to IARPC, are there any existing mappings from other repositories to NASA CMR? Do other repositories have a metadata submission API that I could use to submit metadata to you? And would you like to work with us to cross-list metadata between your repository and ORNL DAAC, or all of NASA CMR? So with that, I don't want to waste a lot of time, and I want to hear some answers and thoughts about these specific questions. So,
thank you so much, Allison. I think the idea is that we'll have all the presentations, and then we will do questions at the end. So Matt Jones, you are up.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen?
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, great. So I will talk for a few minutes about metadata interoperability for the DataONE Federation and how it relates to the Arctic Data Center. Hopefully, Allison, I'll be able to address a couple of the questions that you asked there. As many of you are probably aware, DataONE is a federation of environmental and earth science repositories. There's currently 42 members spanning international context, but primarily focused in the US at the current time. I've listed on the right-hand side of this slide a bunch of the Arctic-related repositories that contain Arctic data, and we're constantly sort of expanding that. So the Arctic Data Center is one of those. Pangea has a lot of Arctic content. IARC, the International Arctic Research Center. NCI, the NOAA facility, has a lot of Arctic data. There's Arctic data out of the Department of Energy from ESS Dive. And just this morning, for example, we were talking to the ARM archive out of DOE about Arctic data and them becoming a member of DataONE. So there's a large collection of repositories that are part of DataONE. And we have, through that sort of federation, have built a global catalog of approaching 900,000 data sets that span a global geographic distribution, including many data sets in the Arctic, as sort of shown on this slide. The way we've accomplished that is by basically embracing the heterogeneity that is present among that repository network and ecosystem. And we try to deal with the metadata and the systems that people have standardized on within their particular communities of practice. So we found that across the group of many dozens of repositories that they support many different metadata standards and data representation standards. And rather than trying to get them to all agree on one, we've sort of tried to build a harmonization system that crosswalks all of the different metadata standards that we find in the wild. So some of the primary ones are ISO, EML, FGDC, METS, data site metadata, and those things. And what we do is we harvest those from all of the different protocols that people use for exposing metadata that we can support. So the primary ones are the catalog services for the web, the Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting, and schema.org mechanisms for publishing metadata on dataset landing pages. So any of those mechanisms can be used. We extract metadata out of each of the different standards, publish that into a Solr index, and then make that available through an open API. So anybody can search this whole collection of metadata using the open API, and then
Sounds like we might have a technical difficulty.
Yes, it seems that he's frozen.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Meredith, any advice?
Yeah, I would wait for another 15 seconds and then, okay, so it looks like he might have dropped off.
Maybe he lost his.
Yes. So I would suggest just waiting to see if he can reconnect quickly, and if not, moving on to the next person.
Okay, and I will email him just so that he's aware that he has dropped.
He's no longer among us. Oh, okay. Back in the room.
oops, looks like I got dumped off the internet there.
No worries.
Where was I when I got disconnected?
The API allows access to whatever and everything.
Yeah, it was sort of the schematic of all the sources, and you were just starting to move towards the solar part of it.
Got it. Okay. Let me reshare my screen here.
Yeah, and Matt, I might suggest if your internet connection is shaky, turning off your video. That can help free up some bandwidth. Is he frozen again?
Looks like it.
Why don't we go ahead and move on to Alison Gaylord, and then if Matt can figure out his connection, we can maybe circle back around.
Yeah, and you should have the ability as the host to stop his screen share.
Gotcha. Just share. Okay. So Allison, you are set to start. And
Okay. All right.
So Allison, sorry, I'm back, but I switched internet connections, and looks like you're switching to another.
Oh, we can let you finish.
we can let you finish,
after
Matt,
you.
No problem.
since you're able to.
Okay, let's see if this works better now.
And recall that we're aiming for about 5 or so minutes each, so just so that we have enough time for some discussion at the end.
Yep, and I'm almost done.
Great.
So, so yeah, I was saying here that we harvest the solar and we produce an open API, which then lets people search that both through the API and through our search interface. You end up searching all the repositories that are part of the Federation because of that metadata harmonization. I want to mention that we've been building a metadata quality assessment service that lets people build custom metadata evaluation services. So this is a project I've been doing with Ted Haberman. We can build very comprehensive sets of metadata checks in multiple languages, and then check all the metadata records across the whole network to see how they fit. One of the things that we're doing for that is to build one that's specifically focused on FAIR. We've developed over 100 quantitative checks for the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable parts of FAIR, and that allows us to build aggregated reports about metadata quality across these repository networks. That also lets us do time series analysis of where collections are going for repositories or for users or user groups, and look at how they're faring against these different metadata recommendations that are in the community. We can also do both spatial and longitudinal analyses of that metadata quality using that set of tools. And then finally, I wanted to mention another focus that we're really putting time into is semantics and how to harmonize, in particular, measurement vocabulary semantics for parameters and measured variables across data systems, and trying to get people to annotate data using standard terminologies that allow us to link data sets by the standard types of measurements that they make. And so we do that through a common sort of framework model called OBOE, and then that model allows us to link to different vocabularies that let us sort of standardize the types of measurement types that are in a particular metadata repository. So those three things, really, the metadata harmonization, quality services, and then the semantics standardization are some of our major efforts on metadata interoperability. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. And Allison, take it away.
Okay, let's see here. All right. Hi, I'm Alison Gaylord, and I've been working with Dr. Bill Manley and Dr. Craig Tweedy's team for the last, since 2006 on a different level of metadata interoperability. We've been developing some web-based map viewers. One is called the Arctic Research Mapping Application, and the second is the Arctic Observing Viewer. And we were tasked back in 2006 by Simon Stevenson and Renee Crane with the NSF Office of Polar Programs to come up with a means to track where IARPC agencies were funding projects across the circumpolar region. And shortly after that, I became involved in a project here in our working group in Alaska called the Alaska Data Integration Work Group. And the same effort was happening where there were different federal agencies and state agencies circulating numerous Excel spreadsheets trying to collect lists of which projects were funded. And it soon became obvious that we needed a machine-readable standard to capture that information. So our work group worked up standards based on FGDC, and then we soon moved on to ISO 19115-2, and then 115 or 11-1 at any rate. So while I'm a geospatial person, we feel that this metadata interoperability is really the key piece of what our work is here. So I'll go into that, the differences in our conceptual model a little bit. Let's see here. Sorry, I got 3 screens. So with our map, we're tracking project level information, just this very high level discovery information about the who, what, when, and where. And then through our metadata for the Arctic Observing Bureau, we're getting into another level of interim detail of where the sites for each project are occurring. So one project may have 50 sites, for instance, on the North Slope. And those sites may be generating hundreds of data sets that are then archived with the NSF Arctic Data Center, the NASA DAACs, et cetera. So we're really focused on probably a different level of audience. I mean, we've really been trying to serve the needs of project planners, NSF funding officers, the observatory planning networks, and then, working off of what we consider a project data lifecycle, which initiates with the funding of the project that is then often goes to the field to collect data or observations, and then archives the information with the data archives. So our work kicks off when an award is actually funded. And so through our map, we are capturing, we've got almost 3,000 research projects, largely funded by NSF, but other IARPC agencies, and then close to 20,000 observing sites that are part of the Arctic Observing Network. And then we link out to the archives for the data. So Alison Boyer put out the question of how to promote harvesting from your repository by aggregating catalogs through interoperability. And we have We haven't really done anything super fancy. We have a web accessible folders, and then we have RESTful endpoints for harvesting our metadata records. And those have been publicly available since 2009. I'm probably not going to get into this in too much detail because it looks like Ruth is going to touch on the metadata harvesting matrix relationships. This was an effort that came out of the Polar Federated Search Working Group and the Polar Data Planning Summit last spring. But it was pretty enlightening to see that there are 80 repositories across the region hosting information and harvesting, and some both publishing and harvesting, and some just grading the data. The top aggregators that we found were NASA, DataONE, the Polar Data Catalog, GEOS, and NCEAS. And one common thread that I seem to notice through here is that ISO seems to be a pretty popular metadata standard, which reassures us as we put a lot of effort into working with Ted Haberman as well to jumpstart our ISO implementation for project and site level metadata. And then there's a series of transfer protocols that are obviously most folks are using. So in the project level metadata, we've been working most closely with entities in Alaska, the Arctic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, USGS Science Center, the Alaska Ocean Observing System. We've also been trying to reach out to other entities that we're seeing are hosting project level information to see if we can pull off that discovery level data or the discovery level information. So here's another list of some of those site level metadata repositories. We have information about all the formats that we're making our information available through web services, geospatial web services, and RESTful APIs for the metadata itself on our web pages. There's some implementation examples, annotated templates, and links to use cases, as well as links to our data dictionaries. And with that, I guess I'll let you move on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Allison. Julia, you're up.
Okay, let me get organized here. All right, hopefully you can still hear me. I've been switching around with different computers. I am Julia Collins from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. I'm actually one of the software developers here, not a research scientist, but have a particular interest in how we manage and distribute our metadata. So NSIDC includes, part of its role is as a NASA DAAC, the Distributed Active Archive Center, and we also receive data from other sources or as a result of funding by other sources. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail there, but just to say we have a wide range of different types of data and data from different places. So entering our system.
Julia, do you have a slide to share? Or
oh, I thought I was. Hang on a second.
If you just click the green button down at the bottom.
Thought I already had, but apparently I didn't. Okay, let me try this.
No worries.
Any better?
There you are. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to start back at the slide with pretty pictures and go from there. For metadata curation, we receive information about metadata in various ways. To answer Allison's question about whether we have an API for metadata submission, we do not. There's definitely a human interface. There are a couple of high-level forms, but basically to create a record in our data catalog requires some interaction with the technical writer. They use a metadata interface that we developed here on site to add that metadata to what we call an enterprise database or an EDB. And that's a Postgres database. So the important piece here is that we're storing our metadata in bits and pieces. We're storing the concept, we're not storing a complete metadata record in the database. For distribution, we take those pieces and we put them back together dynamically based on what's been requested. And we use either OAI PMH as a protocol, and then we have a couple of endpoints which are custom protocols, not following any particular standard. And within that protocol, we can send information as ISO 19115, as diff, and we also export some JSON. So to put it all together in a big, slightly scarier picture, we have metadata entering the system through this interface into a database. That database in the middle, our enterprise database, interacts with another custom application we created called Dataset Catalog Services. It can emit OAI PMH endpoints. Those endpoints are used both internally to create our landing pages, or can be harvested by external users. And the Polar Data Catalog, in fact, does harvest our metadata, or they have in the past. We also have an application we developed called the CMR Mediator, and its function is to just serve as another service harvester internally to grab our ISO metadata and deliver that to NASA's Common Metadata Repository. And again, I'm only talking about collection metadata in these cases. So if anybody is interested in the technical details, the Dataset Catalog Services and our CMR Mediator are both Ruby applications using a Sinatra framework. We have reused community code to build the XML and to create the OAI PMH. When we first started using the OAI PMH, we used an off-the-shelf product. I can't remember if it was Java-based or something else, but it simply pointed at a web-accessible folder. So it doesn't need to be this extensive of a system. You do not need the database managing all your pieces. You could also set up an OAI PMH service handler just using off-the-shelf software. And I've included in my slides an example of the links to get to our endpoints. And what I didn't cover here is we do have some activities going on with regard to OpenDAP, emitting JSON that can be used in different ways, particularly for our search. We do support some OpenSearch protocol, but that again is mostly an internal thing. And we do have OGC services, but we haven't generalized these particular services to cover all of our data catalog, whereas what we're doing with the OAI PMH endpoints does include all public data sets in our catalog. And here's a couple reference links, and that's all I have at this point for the high-level NSIDC overview.
Thank you so much, Julia. Ruth, you're up next.
Let me figure out how to stop sharing here.
There you go, I just did it for you.
Oh, thank you.
No worries.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we can see you.
Okay, and you don't see the presenter notes, just the slides, right?
Just the slides.
Okay, so I was asked to talk about international metadata interoperability and federated search, and I took that mostly to mean sort of summarizing the matrix that you saw a little bit earlier today from the meeting in Geneva last fall. And there are basically 81 polar repositories and aggregators in that survey, but I have to say that many of the records are incomplete, and you'll see that here in just a minute. In addition, there's a white paper that's coming out of that group that we hope to have published. We actually hope to have it out for publication already. We're a little bit behind. And there were basically, in addition to the matrix results, about 20 recommendations for data centers and funders and basically the ecosystem. 13 of them were technical, 7 our social or organizational recommendations about things like sustainability and how does one do these sorts of interoperability efforts. And I'm just going to present a few small results. I'm sorry about the quality of the imagery here. I was just using Google's spreadsheets because that's where the data resides to make some graphs, and they aren't the highest quality. But in any case, one of the things I found interesting is that while only about 10% of the participants consider themselves to be pure data aggregators, or metadata aggregators, I should say, and a little more than 60% consider themselves to be repositories. There are nearly a quarter of the entities participating are both an aggregator and a repository. And then there's a small set of none of the above, which I thought the both was very interesting and enlightening, because that shows some of the problems with aggregation, where you have to deconflict the things you're harvesting, because you may be getting the same thing a couple times from different places. In addition, there are a wide range of protocols that data centers are using to basically make their data available or to harvest. And this is sort of a summary of those. I note that only 41 to 46 of the data centers answered the question about any particular one of these. But obviously it looks like OAI PMH is the most routine standard, though RESTful interfaces are probably the most popular at this point. Though I note that being a RESTful interface does not imply they're all the same. They're actually generally all different. So just because a particular protocol has been implemented doesn't guarantee interoperability. But the other thing that's noted is that typically most centers have two or more different protocols implemented. And I think we saw that from some of the other presentations today. In addition, some 55 repositories answered the questions about what kind of metadata standards they were using. And yes, it looks like ISO is winning out, though, of course, just because it's ISO, there's many flavors of ISO and many profiles, again, not particularly guaranteeing interoperability without some level of work. And if you look at the main recommendations that are coming out, they're basically implement schema.org dataset metadata on your landing pages, because that way your data will immediately show up in Google's dataset search. And that the various communities have started extending the schema.org schema to accommodate more information specific to their communities. The bioschema.org folks are working on extensions for the bio community. The ESIP Federation, the Federation of Earth Science Information Partners, Science on Schema.org is working on extensions for the geosciences. And the reason for doing that is that they can facilitate federated search. And I note that NSF's EarthCube program, Geocodes, it has been working by crawling known repositories to accumulate federated discovery system based on these extensions to the schema.org. But that's not all the international activities going on. I'm not going to talk about any that are really well known, like GEOS, but I also note that the Research Data Alliance has also participating as a discipline agnostic group in the schema.org work, and trying to make sure that things happening, for example, at the bioschemas and in the science on the sphere are going together nicely, but they're also working on the semantically standard naming, and I think Matt actually is part of that. And in addition, the ESIP Semantic Technologies Committee has been working on, has a repository for earth science ontologies and vocabularies, etc., and is working to harmonize the main geoscience ontologies with OBO Foundry, primarily bio and environmental ontologies, so that systems can be built that understand and support users from each kind of community. And so that basically facilitates queries across disciplines. And that's all I had.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Great. Thank you to Ruth, and thanks to all of you for your great presentations. A lot of information, a lot to think about. As I indicated in the chat, I have a direct comment to one of Allison's questions, but before I do that, maybe I will go out to Allison and to you all to see if there's anything specific, perhaps Allison, that you saw in here that you'd like to know more about, or if people have direct answers to Allison's questions.
Yeah, this has been very helpful for me. And some of the things I was partially aware of, some of these I had no idea, so it's great. So I wanted to ask about specifically OAI PMH. And for those of you at NSIDC, do you know if there's any capability from NASA's side in exposing an endpoint?
I don't, this is Julia. I don't know if, I have not been aware of a CMR, an endpoint to deliver metadata to CMR through OAI PMH. I think Shannon Leslie might be on the call, or she was, and she may have some input, or others. So to my knowledge, NASA's endpoints for CMR are all their custom APIs that they have developed.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was just...
Although, I have to take that back slightly. I think GCMD used to harvest using OAI PMH, but since the transition to the CMR, I don't think that endpoint still lives.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, this is Giri, Alison. We sit next to each other. Yeah, I was about to say ORNL DAAC, we used to have the OAI PMH, and we used to distribute it to GCMD and few other folks. I believe that service is still running.
Oh,
yeah.
well,
Yeah, I'll talk about that. Yeah.
Several years ago then.
Yeah, yeah.
In any case, it's, I don't know exactly why ORNL DAAC is not part of DataONE or is not an active member anymore, but it seems like that might be a route towards sharing as well. So yeah, as far as specifics, I think I need to check out some of these resources that you all...
You were a member before.
Mm-hmm.
We have been a member in the past, yeah.
Yeah, and we could talk about what it would take to re-enable that.
Right. But I was very heartened also to hear that possibly, Ruth, your recommendation that each repository expose schema.org metadata, I think that's a great idea. I really support that recommendation because it seems to be really helpful when people are Googling for data, at least. And we've been exposing schema.org metadata for about a year now, and we've seen a big effect of that in our web analytics for visitors coming in through Google Dataset search. So I think that's a cool idea.
Yeah, I just want to disabuse you of the notion that that was my recommendation.
Okay.
I agree with it, but actually it was the recommendation of the entire group in Geneva, which is, a couple dozen people or more.
All right, thank you.
So I'm going to add in there as somebody who's been in the polar data community for 20 years this year. That's the first time I've been to a polar data meeting, a larger one, where everyone has agreed on taking a particular approach. So I would say that it is not the solution to everything, but schema.org I think has to be a core for our community. Okay, actually maybe at this point I'll add a little bit. I do not claim to speak for the Polar Data Catalog, but I do work closely with Gabrielle Alix and Wesley Van Wicken, who runs the Polar Data Catalog. They have done a lot, as you know, in terms of aggregation, and I do know that they use OAI PMH. They may also have some other protocols or other services that they use. When I last knew more about the details, they were using a fairly standard schema that fit very well with the International Polar Year schema that was agreed on by many nations and that I think most of us are compliant with. So I do not think technically it's particularly challenging to share your metadata with them, and if they do not connect, they were on some of the emails, but I can connect with them, and also through this CCADI that I put into the chat, where we're bringing together multiple Canadian data centers that will all be federated, including the Polar Data Catalog. So that work actually started about on April 1st, that project, and so over the summer we're going to be doing a lot of work exactly on this topic of how to federate, and it would be great to think about international federation as well as the national level. So.
That sounds great, Peter. I've just got a couple people that I've talked to at Polar Data Catalog, but it doesn't, certainly not maybe the right person or the right technical contact. So I'm still looking for that person to really exchange information with.
Okay, I can facilitate that. It might be an issue of timing right now. There are 3 different Arctic calls, proposal deadlines on April 30th. So many people in the Canadian system are quite full on right now. So.
Okay.
Hey, this is Bill Manley. So I have a question about the Canadian Polar Data Catalog, and I think they're using the North American profile for 19115. Is that right?
I believe so, but that's something I'll have to check. Initially, they were more mapping to the IPY more at the discovery level, but I believe that they have also moved to the North American profile. But we'll need to check with Gabrielle in particular on that.
And that echoes a little bit that Ruth brought up, that there are many different flavors even within specific profiles for ISO.
Yeah, and this has come up a lot in our conversations over the years, where I think what we tend to be thinking for ISO is it's, as Ted would say, sort of the canonical sort of target, that lingua franca, because it's so comprehensive, but you may end up mapping many, I think he calls them dialects, that would then, map to that. And I suspect that we are in that situation within our community, or that's what we're finding from our work.
Yeah, this is Matt. I would absolutely agree with that. We found many different flavors of ISO. Even groups that say they conform to one schema don't necessarily conform exactly to that schema. And so we have multiple different profiles supported within the DataONE mappings. And even within a profile, we found that there's enough flexibility in the ISO schema that people use different conventions for where they put different types of metadata. And so there's actually a fair amount of work in the harmonization you need to do to just figure out what different communities are using. So like Pangea and NOAA, for example, use the same ISO schemas, but they put information in very different locations for the same kinds of information. So any mapping has to take that into account.
So you all have developed crosswalks for different flavors of the same profile even?
Yeah, for the whenever each time we bring on a new repository, we examine their metadata holdings and try to figure out how much an existing profile can be used or an existing mapping versus where we have to customize.
Yeah, that's a lot of good work. Those crosswalks, do you share them? That would be really helpful. I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah, they're all done programmatically through a set of XPath extraction expressions, and that's all open source and available through our GitHub repositories.
Great.
Great. Are there any other questions or comments?
Well, I wanted to add, when you were talking about the semantic standards for measurements, even just working on 2 projects with NG Arctic and NASA Above, I'm finding that people call things very different variable names or parameter names, even amongst 2 different projects that are both here physically located. And so it would be really helpful to get with you about the semantic standards that you've developed or to have access to those, because we're just kind of casting around for some kind of guidance. And if you've already developed some standards, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, you know, I would probably defer to, so Mark Schildauer, who's on the call, and Ruth already mentioned the Polar Data Semantics working group. And we've been working with those groups, and Mark and Ruth and others have been contributing to ENVO and some of these other standard ontologies for parameters. I think one of the things that they're doing is trying to develop them out further so they have better coverage of the kinds of measurement types we need. But Mark or Ruth might have more to say about how we can work compatibly on that.
In the time frame that Allison has between now and September, you know, all of the work that we're doing is showing up on the OBO Foundry in ENVO. So you could just go there. But I note that if you're really concerned about measurements and parameters and those sort of naming conventions, you might want to take a look at what Scott Peckham has been doing with geosemantics.org, I think it is, because he's got a very standard way of naming things so that if 2 people were following the rules, they would end up with the same name for the same thing. And I don't know that it'll be, I mean, you might look at it now, but in the long term, I'm pretty certain that that's kind of where we have to head, where names for parameters and things like that have a set of rules that you use to invent them. And that set of rules doesn't have to be very complicated. It just has to be, you know, generally used, and then you won't have the kinds of problems you've been having.
Ruth, whose method was that I missed that?
Scott Peckham. He's been working through the EarthCube programs to do this. And so he's had a number of grants. He started off working primarily trying to make models talk together well with standard parameter names, and has expanded greatly off that to just a general parameter names.
I might also suggest, if you haven't already done so, to go back from semantic representations to the foundation, which is the ISO observation and measurement standard that was mentioned in one of the proposals as well, because that really gives you a foundational model in terms of modeling observations and measurements that then transcends or migrates up into the semantic representations.
Yeah, I just, hi, this is Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to add a comment. Matt briefly showed a model for observations and measurements that we're using within DataONE and the Arctic Data Center semantic efforts, and that was called OBOE. That is, in fact, very closely harmonized with something you just mentioned, Peter, like, for instance, the OGC and ISO standards of ONM and SOSA, which are all of which are represented in a semantic web language framework, which I think is really important, meaning that we are expressing the relationships among terms, whether they are class, subclass relationships, or other sorts of reflexive or transitive relationships in a very specific language of RDF and OWL. And so Suite and ENVO, which Ruth mentioned, are represented in RDF and OWL. And the key point there is that that means that every term is provided with a dereferenceable HTTP URI, which links to that term in the ontology, and then you can see how the term is defined and related to other terms in very formal, logical ways. So that's what we're pursuing currently with the Arctic Data Center, as well as the semantics efforts on DataONE. That's what we've been seeing a lot of with ESIP and the recent RDA working groups in this area as well.
This is Jonathan. I have a follow-on question. Has the representation moved beyond SCOS, a simple knowledge organization system, or are we?
The Obo Foundry ontologies and Suite as well are both they're using some SCOS terms which don't have a very strong semantic capability in the sense of inferencing, but they are in fact using a lot of OWL level axioms, which do allow for some interesting axioms. I don't want to talk gibberish here, but things like really strict class subclass as opposed to just very loosey-goosey related to relationships like in SCOS, or broader than, narrower than, as well as domain and range constraints. So if you took a look at ENVO, for instance, it's very nicely axiomatized using OWL axioms.
Great. Thank you all. I think I'm going to start wrapping us up in case, so if there's maybe one last short question or comment, that's welcome. And then I just have a business item to address, and then we'll be at our time.
Hey, Peter, this is Giri. Very quick question. Did we get the action items or the summary report from the Geneva meeting, or is it still under the development?
So the summary report is there. We're working, Øystein and I have been working, albeit a bit slowly, on the specific diagrams of the data infrastructures that we have done, that we documented. The other activity is the one that Ruth referred to, the publication. So I know most of the background work has been done on the publication, or at least on the matrix, et cetera, although there are some gaps, and we're just trying to work with Pip now to kind of get that to completion. So I would say we're probably about a month away or so from having both of those completed at a detailed level, but the summary report that's on the site has some of the higher level outcomes, such as we've agreed on schema.org as something that people will implement and so on.
Okay, thank you.
So, great. Okay, well, thank you all. This was actually a really enjoyable session for me, and I hope for you. Learned a lot, and I'm pleased that so many people could make it out. The business item that I am referring to is my participation in this group. I have, as of July 1st, I'll be starting a tenure track position at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. So I will be retaining a small position at NSIDC, but mostly will be on the other side of the border. So I will be stepping down as the primary lead of this particular group. Jonathan Blythe has joined us as a co-lead, and he will be ramping up to take some more leadership role. We're also working with the IARPC executive to reach out to organizations within the IARPC family to bring on other leadership. We can actually have well, I know at least some other groups have up to 4 co-leads, so it's not limited to 1 or 2. I will continue to participate. You haven't seen the last of me in this context, in that every quarter we are working to have a joint meeting with the observing sub-team. In that case, looking at the relationship between the data and the observing system activities. And that will also include a lot of reference to international work. So I'll continue to chair the International Arctic Data Committee, and I'll be participating more in that capacity and as just a Canadian participant. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for making this, I think it's been almost 4 years that I've been involved, a really great experience and an excellent sort of learning platform for me.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Congratulations, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Maybe we're right on time, but I would encourage you to think about joining and contributing to the leadership. If we get enough people, it doesn't have to be particularly onerous or time consuming. And I think a lot of you have a lot that you could contribute to the process. So if you see a message come across your desk, maybe don't put it into the bin and think about it seriously.
Peter, this is Sarah. Can I just add my thanks for everything that you've done to help in the leadership of this team, and thank Jonathan for also stepping up to co-lead with you. There will be an announcement going out on the IARPC Collaborations website that will be trying to replace you, and so people can keep their eyes out for that. But anybody can contact Kelley or me or Meredith if they have an interest or if they have questions.
Great, thank you, Sarah. It's been my pleasure, and I always try to keep us on time, so I see it's 2 o'clock, and I'm going to say we're done for today.
Thanks, Peter, and boy, are we going to miss you as leading this.
Well, said you won't be entirely rid of me, so I'll still try and make it to the meetings. Okay, take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Well,
See y'all.